Hello, everyone. This is Christina Jang from ITDP, and welcome to our webinar today. Before we begin, there are just a couple of things to note. This webinar will be recorded, and both the recording and PowerPoint will be available online on our website, ittdp.org, within 2 weeks. To interact with our host today, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It should be a little white icon in the center. And we request you refrain from sending questions through the chat box. As you use the Q&A function, use it throughout the presentation, and we will be answering any inquiries at the end. So again, thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar is titled Pedestrians First, Tools for a Walkable City. This webinar will highlight ITDP's new tool for measuring walkability. This tool, which draws on the expertise from all our field staff from around the world, measures walkability at 3 scales and can be used in any city in the world. Since walking is a part of almost every trip made, it is necessary to understand how to make our cities more walkable. Today, our host is Joe Chestnut, the Transport Research Associate at ITDP at our DC office. Joe, can you just say hi so I can make sure your sound is working?
Hey, everyone.
So Joe here works on implementing indicators to analyze organizational impact, urban growth, and walkability. Prior to his work at ITDP, he was a researcher at the Brookings Institution in their Metropolitan Policy Program. He has a bachelor's degree in international affairs and geography from the George Washington University, and also a master's degree in geography, also from George Washington University. Joe, now I'll hand it off to you, and you can feel free to begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Christina, and thank you all attendees for participating in and attending this webinar. So as Christina mentioned, I will be presenting on Pedestrians First, which is ITDP's new toolkit for measuring walkability in cities. And so I know what you're all thinking, do we really need another walkability tool? So I wanted to just highlight some of the ways that this walkability tool differs from ones you've probably seen in the past. So first, it uses global examples, and it was really built off of the expertise of our field offices from around the world. We really wanted to avoid having a Western-centric and Euro-centric walkability tool like many of the other ones that we've seen, and make sure that we have a walkability tool that can be used in any city around the world. It can be used in New York, it can be used in Nairobi, and it can be used anywhere in between. Also, the tool has pretty quick and inexpensive data that's required for it. Most of this data is free. You can go out and find it by walking around the city. You can go and find it by looking at maps on the internet. The data is easy to find and easy to use. The metrics in the tool are also easy to use, and they're easy to understand. We wanted to make that a real important feature of the tool so that anyone can use the tool and understand, okay, how does this metric relate to walkability, and how can I use this metric to improve walkability in my city? As Christina mentioned, the tool operates at 3 different scales to give a more nuanced and holistic understanding of walkability in the city. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's a globally applicable tool. You can really use it in any city around the world. So before I dig into the actual metrics of the tool, I wanted to cover some of the framework and theory behind the tool and why we're using certain metrics. I know theory is everyone's favorite part of every presentation, so just bear with me for a few minutes while I go through this before we get to the actual metrics. So we used this pyramid, this walkability hierarchy of needs, as the basis for developing and prioritizing the metrics that we used in the tool. So it starts at passable, goes all the way up to enjoyable. And when we're talking about passable in this tool or in this pyramid, we're really thinking about how can someone get from one place to another? Is that physically possible for them to do in the built environment? From passable, we move up to accessible, where we're thinking about, are there destinations that can be reached? Are there things that people want to go to in an area? Next up, we have safe, which is really about protection from crime and from traffic. Once we move on to convenient, it's about, is walking easy to do? you move up to comfortable, and is walking something that's not physically taxing, is something that you're going to be able to do easily. And then finally, we get to enjoyable, which is where we want all of our walking environments to be, because we really want walking to be fun. We want people to want to go walk around their cities and enjoy them on foot. So when we were developing this tool, we thought about 3 key features of walkability. The first of these is infrastructure. And so infrastructure you can think about as the built environment upon which you would be doing walking. So this is sidewalks, this is crosswalks, this is your block grid of a city, things of that nature. And next we have activity. And so activity is really thinking about, are there people around? Are there things that you're going to walk to? Are there things you want to walk to? And so activity is really important, one from a standpoint of whether or not people are going to be walking because they need to go to things, but also from the standpoint of having more people on the street and more eyes on the street, and how that can increase safety and security on the street. So next we have priority. Priority is a little more abstract than activity and infrastructure, but priority is really about taking preference to sustainable modes over private car usage. So really moving the emphasis of the built environment from the car back to pedestrians, and putting pedestrians first in the walking and the planning of urban areas. So with these 3 features of walkability, infrastructure, activity, and priority, you really need to have all 3 at once to get the best and most holistic understanding of walkability. If you have the infrastructure, but your city is designed for cars and there are no destinations you can walk to, then people aren't going to walk. If you have things that people want to walk to, but there's no infrastructure for them to walk on, then again, people aren't going to walk. You have to have all 3 working in concert to really create an environment that both allows for walkability, but also facilitates walking as a preferred mode of transport. So the tool operates at 3 scales. This is one of the things that we really think sets this tool apart from a lot of other ones. So it operates first at the metropolitan scale, thinking about the entire urban area. Then we move down a little bit into the neighborhood scale. When we say neighborhood, most of the time we're meaning an area about 1 square kilometer, but that size can vary depending on essentially how much time you want to put into the tool. Obviously, a larger area is going to require a little bit more time and a little bit more work, and a smaller area will require less. But this is just a slightly more granular, a little more focused set of metrics. And then finally, we have the street scale. This tool can be used on an individual block by block basis to give a very granular, very detailed understanding of walkability and features of walkability. And so I included this chart to talk about the versatility of the tool. I won't go over the description too much because I'm going to move into that later. But I did want to highlight the target populations and just how this tool can be used by a variety of people, from decision makers down to advocates and technical practitioners. A whole range of individuals can use this tool, and we want it to be accessible to all types of people so that everyone can understand walkability in their city. And I also wanted to highlight just how it can be used for multiple types of interventions. It can be used all the way up at metropolitan-wide planning. It can be used all the way down at street design and incorporating individual features on individual streets. So now I'm going to go ahead and get into some of the indicators. So without further ado, we'll move into our city indicator, which is block density. So currently, this is our only indicator at the citywide metropolitan scale. And so block density is a measurement of the number of blocks per square kilometer. We measured this in a range of cities using GIS software. We wanted to include a lot of cities in the tool so that not everyone has to calculate this themselves, because it can be a little technical. And so you can see here on this chart, we have cities like Nairobi, whose block density are pretty low, and cities like Manila, whose block densities are really, really high. And I wanted to emphasize that block density is just one aspect of walkability at the citywide level. We don't mean this to say that Manila is the most walkable city because it has the densest block grid, but I do think it's important to think about block density as an infrastructure component of walkability. It's one piece of the puzzle. So you can see here on this map, kind of, it's a little blurry, the block densities of Manila, who had the highest block density, and Nairobi, which had the lowest. And I just included this so you can really see the difference of those block densities. And then here I have a couple of maps of Kuala Lumpur's block density, and I included these to give a better idea of how we're calculating it. So you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, the number of blocks in each of these different portions of Kuala Lumpur. And I just wanted to include this so you could see, oh, so these sections don't have that many blocks. Other areas have a lot of blocks. And just to give a better idea of how it is that we're measuring this. And also, the way that we're defining block here is a developed piece of land that is surrounded by publicly accessible passages. So it's not just streets, it can be any sort of pedestrian passage. Just wanted to quickly highlight that. So as I mentioned, block density is an infrastructure measure, and it is the only current measure that we have at the metropolitan level. But we do have several others that are in development and that we hope to include in this tool in the future. This is not an exhaustive list of the ones that we're looking at, but I wanted to just put them in there and make sure that everyone knows that when you're looking at walkability and you are using this tool and looking at block density, it's also a good idea to be thinking about these other types of metrics, to think about the density in population of the city, to think about how car space is allocated in the city relative to pedestrian space, just to give a little bit more nuance to the block density measure. So now moving down to the neighborhood scale. The metrics in the neighborhood scale are all from ITDP's TOD standard. We picked 11 of those metrics that were really focused on walkability, and we pulled them into the walkability tool. You can see all 11 of them on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm only going to be talking about the bolded ones today, so crosswalks, visually active frontage, and prioritized connectivity. Just because, unfortunately, we don't have quite enough time to go through all 11 metrics in detail, but I think that these three give a good example of the types of metrics we included and how they're measured. So thinking about crosswalks, completeness of an all-accessible pedestrian network is a basic requirement for walkability in a city. So when we're thinking about crosswalks, we're thinking about things that are barrier-free, 2 meters in width, provide refuge islands for pedestrians when necessary, and have adequate lighting. So these crosswalks really need to be at all directions at the intersection. And like I mentioned, the pedestrian islands are a really important piece of this when we're thinking about allowing infrastructure for all different types of people. So if you're a person who's moving a little slower, maybe you have kids with you, or maybe you're older and aren't moving so fast, or maybe you just aren't in a hurry, having these refuge islands in crosswalks that go across more than about 2 lanes of traffic are a really important piece to allow you to use the infrastructure without ending up putting yourself in danger or ending up in the way, stuck in that crosswalk when the signal changes. So here's an example of a pretty good crosswalk that's in Kuala Lumpur. So this crosswalk crosses several lanes of traffic, but it does have that pedestrian refuge in the middle. Also, it's certainly 2 meters wide. This area is pretty well lit, even at night. And I wanted to point out too that you can see in the pedestrian island and further at the edge of the crosswalk how it is ramped down. And this would allow a wheelchair user or someone who has a walker or something of that nature to easily use this piece of infrastructure. And so when we're talking about all accessible pedestrian environments, this is a good example of the type of thing we're thinking about. You know, is this a barrier-free piece of infrastructure for someone using a wheelchair or someone who's disabled in some other way? Can everyone use this piece of infrastructure? So here's an example of a crosswalk that's not quite as barrier-free and wouldn't be what we consider a qualifying crosswalk. So it is 2 meters wide, it looks like, and it's painted, which is nice. But if you were in a wheelchair, you could not get to this crosswalk. You know, there's a sign in the way. It looks like there's some rocks or some concrete slabs in the way. But also, if you did manage to get into the crosswalk, you couldn't get out of it because it's not ramped down on the other side. It's got this ledge. And so this is I included this because it's a bad example of a crosswalk, but it's a good example of a bad crosswalk. So here's the actual measurement that you would do for this specific metric. So you'd be counting up all of the intersections, and then you would be counting all of the intersections that have a qualifying crosswalk. And essentially, you're just getting a percentage of the number of qualifying crosswalks out of the total number. And for this, the goal is really 100%. Like I said, this is a basic requirement for walkability. Everyone should be able to get around the city by walking. And it's important to have crosswalks that work for everyone. So one of the aspects of this tool that I think is really great is that we include best practice examples. And with those best practice examples, we also include policy recommendations. So the best practice example that we have for the crosswalks is the Reforma development in Mexico City. And I really just wanted to include this to highlight how we're drawing on international examples and also just to highlight those policy recommendations. And so we have policy recommendations for every one of the metrics from the citywide scale all the way down to the individual street scale. So the next metric I'm going to talk about is visually active frontage. And so a couple of quick definitions. When we say visually active, we mean a section of the walkway that has building frontage that is visually penetrable. That's what we're talking about by visually active. And then for a walkway to be considered visually active, at least 20% of the frontage has to be visually penetrable. So you can see in this picture on the right that, you know, the two sides are both very visually penetrable. The whole section of this little walkway actually was visually penetrable, well over 20%. So I just included that because it's a good example of the type of buildings that you would see that would count as visually penetrable. This is another photo that's actually only about 2 blocks away from the previous photo. And I included this to show another example of the type of buildings that would count as visually active. So you can see on the ground level of these buildings, there are windows, there are people walking around, you can see into the shops, the people in the shops can see out and see you. And this is really important for creating a sense of safety and security in an area. You know that there are people around who will see if something happens to you. There are people there that can help you out if something's going on. So this is an example of a section of block that is not visually penetrable. And you know, I certainly wouldn't want to walk here. It doesn't look very appealing. You know, disregarding the barrier across the sidewalk, you can see on the left-hand side here that, you know, there's really zero visually active frontage here. And so this is just a section of crosswalk that wouldn't count. So the actual measurement method for this one is similar to the crosswalk measure, where you're counting up the number of walkway segments, and then you're counting up the number of those walkway segments that are visually active. And so the goal here is to have at least 90% of those walkway segments be visually active. So the best practice example we have here is Central St. Giles in London. And you can see here that the area is very visually active. You can see into these restaurants. You can see out onto the street. And also these restaurants have, sort of extended their space with these chairs and tables out into the area, which adds to the level of activity. And again, we have policy recommendations here for this metric. So the final neighborhood level metric that I'm going to talk about is prioritized connectivity. And so this is really just the ratio of pedestrian to motor vehicle intersections. So in this chart or graphic, you can see the orange is the motor vehicle area, and so there are only a handful of intersections there. And the blue is the pedestrian area, and there are quite a few intersections there. And this is really what we're looking for here. We want there to be a greater number of pedestrian intersections than motor vehicle ones. This allows for more trips by walking. It allows for easier access by walking than you would get in a car. And so it's really, this metric is about pulling people from their cars to their feet and having them walking through the city instead of driving around it. And so this is a photo also from Kuala Lumpur, where you can see under where it says Mango, there is a pedestrian walkway through there. And this photo is taken from a crosswalk in the street. And it's a good example of the type of walkway that would be for pedestrians, but not for cars. And so the measurement technique here, you count up all of the motor vehicle intersections, then you count up all of the pedestrian intersections. You quantify the intersections based on the little formula we have down here for the type of intersection it is. Intersections that offer more connectivity score a little higher. And then you want to get a ratio of your pedestrian intersections to motor vehicle intersections. The goal here is to have 2 or more. So for every 1 motor vehicle intersection, you should have 2 pedestrian ones. And this is really so that the city is easier to access by walking than it is by driving. We want to be shifting people from private vehicles to more sustainable modes, whether that be walking or biking or forms of public transportation. But with this metric, it's really all about, is the city more accessible for people or is it more accessible for cars? And we want it to be more accessible for people. So our best practice example here is Västra in Malmo in Sweden. And I took this screenshot from Google Earth, and you can start to see where there are pedestrian intersections that vastly outnumber the number of car intersections. The Västra had a ratio of 8.75 pedestrian intersections for every 1 vehicle intersection. They really, in their design here, were able to prioritize walking and put pedestrians first over cars. So moving down to the street scale, we have this infographic, which I included so that I can talk just about the types of things that are in our street scale metrics. So at the street scale, we have a checklist. We don't necessarily expect every street to check off every single thing on the checklist, but everything that is included in the checklist is good for walkability. And so the more you have, the better. If you think your street is not very walkable, maybe including some of these things on your street would improve the walkability. So just going through these numbers one at a time, and you can see they're broken down into that infrastructure, activity, and priority. The first one is that sidewalks are sufficiently wide for people to use. You want your sidewalks to be at least 1.5, 1.8 to 2 meters in width so that people in wheelchairs can use them and so that they're accessible to all types of people. If you look at number 2, this goes back to crosswalks. You want to have crosswalks on your street that are accessible for everyone and that allow pedestrians to move freely through the city. Number 3, you can see is about having signals at your crosswalks that give priority to pedestrians and allow them to use the street first over cars. 4 is having a mix of activities. 5 is the presence of street vendors. Both of those are just good ways to get people out on the street and provide destinations that people want to walk to and can walk to. And then 6 is having on-street parking that's managed, it has a cost. And we included that in the activity section because it's really, we want those people to get out of their cars so that they can walk to those activities. Moving into priority, we have at number 7, the presence of transit. The more transit that is present, the more easily people can reach an area of the city without having to walk. And then with 8, we have small street widths because that helps slow down traffic. And then with 9, we have slow traffic speeds. We really want cars to be moving slowly so that the environment is safe for pedestrians. So this is what the actual checklist looks like. This is not the entirety of it. It's just 2 small sections of it. But I wanted to give an idea of, specifically what does this checklist look like? What type of things are included? So you can see here, it has things like seating facilities, garbage bins, street vendors, public toilets, how close you are to transit, what type of transit is there. And again, we don't necessarily expect every seat or every street to have public toilets on it, but the more streets that have those type of features, the more walkable an area will be. So here's another photo from Kuala Lumpur of a street, and just if you were using the checklist, just that portion we were just looking at, some of the things that you would be able to check off for this street would be the presence of seating. You'd be able to check off garbage bins. You would also be able to check off the presence to transit. This is a bus stop that's served very frequently. Also, this is a dockless bike share bike here. So that's present, it has a couple of different types of modes you can access by walking. And so this street, for that section of the checklist, at least does pretty well. So in the future with this walkability tool, there are a couple of things that we're really looking at. One, we are trying to incorporate more of those citywide indicators that I mentioned at the beginning and bringing in indicators at the city level that are good for not just infrastructure, but also looking at and understanding activity and priority. Also, we are planning to move this tool into an online format so that you can look at the metrics, enter some numbers, get your results, and then get a more tailored best practice example, get better policy recommendations that fit the metrics that you actually achieved. So with that in mind, if any of you are using this tool and have some ideas, we would love to hear them. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to me talk about walkability and how we can put pedestrians first and the metrics that we're using to understand walkability in our cities. We'll start taking questions now. And if any of you are interested in downloading Pedestrians First, you can go to itdp.org/walk and you can download the tool there.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. And yes, as he mentioned, the tool is available on our website, itdp.org, which includes the checklist. When I send the follow-up email with the recording and PowerPoint, I'll also include a link to the tool so you can download it immediately there. So we can go ahead and dive into some of the questions submitted today. The first question here is essentially asking, what is the length for blocks that you are using for this tool? What is the metric?
So for blocks, we're doing a couple of things. When we're looking at block density at the city level, there isn't a specific length. For that, it's just the area that is surrounded on all sides by pedestrian passages that are publicly accessible. So any area that's developed that fits that would count as a block. There is a metric in the neighborhood level that is block length. And for that, you would be measuring in the neighborhood all of the blocks and then finding the longest block. And for that, we want the longest block, I believe, to be less than 150 meters. And for crosswalks, we recommend that if a block is over 150 meters, once it gets to about 200 meters, you should have a crosswalk, even if the block doesn't end. Because studies show that after 200 meters, people are going to cross the street whether or not there's a crosswalk. And it's definitely best to have the infrastructure there for them to use. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Joe. I also received some questions via email before the presentation. This is from Aromal. Does the tool provide any factors to consider for pedestrian corridor improvement? So improving existing pedestrian infrastructures versus implementing new ones?
You know, it doesn't specifically offer improvements in that sense, but I think that when you're using, especially the street level checklist, all of the items that are on there are things that the street should have. And so if something is missing from the street that's on the checklist, you can include that, and that would be in a way to improve it. I think there are also some aesthetic things that you can do to improve the pedestrian infrastructure. So the lighting is adequate, and if there is infrastructure there for lighting, making sure that the bulbs are changed regularly and that the streets are clean, things of that nature.
Great, thanks. The next question here is, for pedestrian intersections, do they count only if it's intended to be used for pedestrians? So I'm assuming they're referring to the checklist. Would an alleyway for cars with no sidewalk count? For example, would an open parking lot without sidewalks, but you are able to cross as a pedestrian, would that count?
So the pedestrian intersections, if something is a shared street, it can count as a pedestrian intersection. But with the example of an alley that doesn't have a sidewalk and is used for cars, you could include that as a pedestrian intersection, but it would also be a vehicle intersection. So it wouldn't, well, actually without sidewalks, it might not even count as a pedestrian one. But looking at the measurement in the tool, the prioritized connectivity one, will give a lot more detail on what specifically counts.
Thanks, Joe. I also see some folks are entering questions in the chat box. If you could please just retype them into the Q&A, that would be great. We're just using the Q&A function for moderation. For the next question, it is from Jackie. Can you please better define a motor vehicle intersection or street and prioritize connectivity? This was from page 48 of your toolkit.
Yeah, so a motor vehicle intersection is anywhere that two motor vehicle streets come together, so, or two or more. So if there are two streets that cross each other, that would be a motor vehicle intersection. A pedestrian intersection would be something like a pedestrian-only footpath that goes through the center of a block that cars cannot use. And so if two of those cross each other, that would be a pedestrian intersection.
I'm going to skip down to some of the questions on the bottom here, talking about some local context. So, apologies, I lost the question. So, are there any cities using this tool already? This is from Bridget Barr.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is one of the things that we're currently working on. So we're in the process of finalizing some cities to hopefully use this tool in a more holistic way. It's been anywhere that we've used our TOD standard, we have used the neighborhood metrics have been used for the tool. So the TOD standard has been used in several cities in Mexico, I believe, and then also several others around the world. We're in the process of using specifically the Pedestrians First tool in a number of cities around the world to get more data that we can use in that online version of the tool.
Great. We also have another question here that's applicable to certain contexts. Does this tool consider the density of street vendors allowed on a busy street, but still make it walkable? This is from Raymond.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is something that's included in the sidewalks metric of the neighborhood portion of the tool. So if the street is too crowded to be walkable, that's something that's taken into account in that portion of the tool. Also with the checklist, street vendors are included on there, but so is, barriers to the street. So if a street has so many vendors on it that you can't walk on it, that would detract in the checklist as well.
Great. This is a question from Aldrin pointing to political will. So how do you think this tool can be used to influence, if not convince, local government, city government to prioritize walkability in spite of budgetary constraints?
That's a really great question. I think one of the great things about this tool, and one of the reasons it was important for us to develop it, is to give people an understanding of walkability and to give them the vocabulary and the vernacular that they need to talk about it to city officials. So if someone wants their street to be more walkable because when they try and walk on it, they don't feel safe or it's not a pleasant experience, I hope that they can use this tool to, at the street level, use the checklist, and it'll tell them exactly the types of things that their street is missing that could improve walkability. And then at the neighborhood level, if you think your neighborhood could be more walkable or you want to understand walkability in your neighborhood better, this using neighborhood level metrics will give you an idea of the types of things that improve walkability, and also the policy recommendations that are in that piece of the tool and in the other pieces will give you specific targeted ways to improve walkability. So for example, if you notice that your neighborhood in the tool does poorly on our mixed use metric, you can go to your city officials, your local representation, and say, hey, I noticed that this is something that my neighborhood doesn't have that's making it less walkable. Here are some policy recommendations that I think that you should advocate for to improve the walkability in this neighborhood. I think that the combination of several metrics that are all separate from each other but work together, and the policy recommendations allow people to really have targeted policy interventions for walkability.
Great, thanks, Joe. The next question here is from Meenakshi, and perhaps this is also referring to your chart where you showed the cities of highest block density, where you mentioned that Manila had very high block density, but you're not necessarily saying that's the most walkable city in the world. So the question is, does high block density ensure high walkability? Maybe you can just review the different metrics or factors that are combined to call an area walkable.
let me just scroll back to the chart really quick. So with block density, I like to think about it as the skeleton of walkability in the city. So the greater that skeleton is, the more connections there are with the blocks, the greater potential for walkability there is. However, if you have the infrastructure, you have this block density, but if you don't have the level of activity, you don't have mixed uses that allow for that allow you to easily access different types of destinations, and you don't have a urban environment that really shifts priority from cars to people and sustainable modes of transit, then your city is not going to be walkable. Block density is the infrastructure piece. It's one of those three: infrastructure, activity, and priority, that need to all be present to allow for walkability. So when I was introducing this tool at the World Urban Forum, someone specifically mentioned, I'm from Manila. I recognize that there's a high block density, but also it's not a great city to walk in. It's the infrastructure, the sidewalks aren't there aren't crosswalks, things like that. And so I think that's a really good example of how you need to have infrastructure, activity, and priority all working together to create a walkable environment. So that's why we have these other city level indicators that we're thinking about and working to develop. The reason they weren't originally included in Pedestrians First is that for a lot of them, the data just isn't quite there at the internationally. Some cities have it, some don't. But also for some of them, we're just still in the process of figuring out how do we exactly best measure this. So that's something we really want to include in later iterations of the tool, especially once we get it up online. But thank you for the question. That was a good one.
Great. I think this is a really important next question. This is from Ruchi. How close are pedestrianization and successful public transit related?
Could you repeat that, Christina?
Yes. How close are pedestrianization and successful public transit related?
Oh, I think that they're very, very closely related. Two peas in a pod, really. So if you are a pedestrian and you're like me and you don't own a car, if there's no public transit, your world is limited to how far you can walk. When you introduce public transit into the equation, I can walk to the public transit, I can ride it to other places that it goes, I can get off, and then I can walk to all of those places too. So by having good, frequent public transportation paired with a good walking environment, you're increasing the number of things that people can reach without a car, you're increasing the number of people that people can reach without a car. You're really expanding the city for people that either choose to not have a car or just aren't able to get one. And you're allowing the city to cater to pedestrians and cater to everyone. If you think about walkability, or if you think about any sort of trip, whether it's a trip you take by airplane, a trip you take by bus, or even one that you're taking by a private car, all of them start with walkability. Walkability pairs with all forms of transportation, and I think public transportation really expands your sphere in a sense when you're able to walk to good public transportation.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump back to Jackie's question from before because she just wants a better definition of the metric. So is a motor vehicle intersection street only, accessible by motor vehicles, pedestrians are not allowed? So I guess the question is, how is that metric defined?
So let me scroll to this real quick. So if you look at the orange dots on here, those are intersections of streets that allow motor vehicles on them. You can see that some of them, like this one down here, let me get the pointer out. Some of them, like this one up here, this is an intersection that cars can use and pedestrians can use. So it's likely something like two streets that meet that have crosswalks. If you look here, this would be just a pedestrian intersection. So this is some sort of pedestrian footpath that crosses with another pedestrian footpath. Cars are not allowed here. This intersection could also be a shared street. So cars are allowed on it, bikes are allowed on it, people are allowed on it. And so it could count as that. There's not an example of an intersection that's just for cars on here, but if you imagine this one up here without the blue dot, so there's no sidewalks, there's no crosswalk, it's just two motor vehicle roads meeting together. That would be an example of just a motor vehicle intersection.
Great, thank you for clarifying that, Joe. So there's some conversation going on where some folks mentioned that having vendors on the streets makes it more walkable, but in other contexts, it actually, there's too much of an overflow on the street. So that really points to one of the other questions asked, which is, will we provide data comparing different cities in which we've scored them with the tool, and will this be public online?
So we're still fleshing out plans for exactly what the online tool will look like. But what we hope to do is have good data and scores for a lot of cities at the neighborhood level. And for those, you could certainly compare neighborhood to neighborhood. And then similarly at the city level, we're hoping to have a lot of cities scored and so you compare city to city. At the street level with the checklist, that one we're not planning, as far as I know currently, we're not planning on having a bunch of scores for that online, just because there are a lot of streets and it would be quite a bit of data. But just to quickly speak on the street vendors, one of the things with the checklist is it's supposed to be somewhat vague and allow for the user, it allows the user some leeway in whether or not they think something counts. So something like a street vendor, you could check it if there's one or two there and they're adding these destinations that you can walk to and it's working well with the urban environment. There are so many street vendors that you can't walk and it's so crowded that walking conditions aren't good. Then you as the checklist user can note that on the checklist. So the checklist is really intended to provide the user a little bit of leeway given the context that they're operating in.
Great, thank you, Joe. This is a question from Yasmin, and we also had one other person submit about communications. So do you think that indicators like pedestrian desire line or wayfinding, signage in general, in the street scale could be added and measured in this tool? So it's really a question about, will communications and branding be considered as an indicator for this tool?
That's a really good question. Off of the top of my head, I don't think that they're currently included, but I definitely think that there is room to include that type of thing in the checklist, especially if, like I was saying, the checklist allows for some give and take by the user of the checklist. If you think that type of thing is really important to the walkability of your area, then you can note it on the checklist and you can include it. Because I do think that signs and telling people how to get to places is really important.
Great, thank you. Another question we had two about trees lining sidewalks and also pointing to green infrastructure. So I'll repeat Helen's question here. Are you considering the incorporation of green infrastructure as a part of your criteria? This would be valuable to address your pyramid, starting with safety, to create a buffer between pedestrians and automobiles, as well as for human health to mitigate particulate matter.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Just to go back to the 11 indicators we have at the neighborhood level. So things like trees are definitely included in the shade and shelter portion of the metric. I do not think that we explicitly talk about green infrastructure. But I do agree that it has a lot of benefits both to walkability and to human health. And I think it's something that we'll certainly consider when we're improving the tool in the future.
Great. From a practical standpoint and actually utilizing the tool, Urban asks, how long does it take for the analysis to be conducted per square kilometer on average? So actually applying this walkability tool to your city.
Yeah, great question. So when I was testing this tool here in DC, I tested it a couple of times, once in an area I thought that was pretty walkable and once in an area that wasn't particularly walkable. So it took, to do the neighborhood level metrics between the data collection and then the calculating, I'd say it took about 4 to 5 hours in the very walkable area. And then I also did the street level checklist on every street in the area. And that took another couple of hours. But I think that using it on every street might be more than most people would do. In the not very walkable area, it actually took less time to do the tool. I'd say both using the street level checklist and the neighborhood level, it took maybe 3 hours, just because since it wasn't very walkable, there wasn't a whole lot to measure. But that was a really good question.
Great, thank you. This is another question from Ruchi. Will making things a bit difficult, such as removing surface parking, provide for better walkability?
Could you repeat that?
Will removing things such as surface parking provide for better walkability? So maybe you could provide just some examples of things that could be changed to provide better walkability.
Yeah, so I mean, speaking of surface parking specifically, if you remove surface parking, it allows you to use that space differently. If you then use that space for providing more pedestrian infrastructure and providing more destinations that are easy to walk to, destinations meaning things like schools or grocery stores, retail, things that you would want to walk to. In that sense, yes, it would improve walkability. If you remove parking and you put in more roadway for cars, then it wouldn't improve walkability. I think it very much just depends on how you are replacing things and how you're choosing to allocate space. But certainly, removing parking is a good step towards walkability most of the time.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take this question from, I'm sorry, I lost it here. Ari Nova. And I just want to emphasize this is more of a scoring tool versus an implementation tool. So the question here is, does the tool consider maintenance of pedestrian walkways, for example, winter maintenance for cities that receive snow or that have snow, or I'm thinking of other cities that have quite a lot of rain?
So it doesn't specifically give any guidance on maintenance, but it does include language that you would score better if things are maintained. So things like the walkways and the crosswalks, if they're not in adequate condition, then they wouldn't be what we consider qualifying walkways or qualifying crosswalks. However, it isn't prescriptive in specific ways of maintaining the infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Joe. The next question here is from Carl. Do signals not impede walking as they force people to wait, even if there's not traffic or when the car would wait? So perhaps, is there any outline for how long, time-wise or seconds, that signals should be for walking and for traffic signals?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I can't remember off of the top of my head the specific details, but we recommend signals that are, I believe, less than 60 seconds. It could be less than 45, but I think it's less than 60. For that reason, we really want to make sure that people can still get where they're going and that we aren't putting signals. We want the signals to be there for people. We don't want the signals to be there to allow the cars to move easily. But especially in roads that have several lanes of traffic, I think that the signals are important for allowing the infrastructure to be safe for people.
Great. This is another question, and it's particularly about active frontage. If you could just redefine it for the audience again. So would this tool consider things like height or transparency of property walls and graffitis to grade at street level segment as visually active? Also, what about physical encroachments or just in general obstacles such as utility poles on sidewalks?
Yeah, so I'll answer the visually active frontage portion of the question first. So visually active for us means visually penetrable. So you can see through it, because we're really thinking about that safety and security portion here, where the eyes on the street, people can see you, you can see people, creates a greater sense of security. And so things like graffiti, which may be visually interesting, if you can't actively see through the building frontage, then it doesn't count as visually active. We're going back to utility poles and things like that that are encroaching on the sidewalk. In the sidewalk metric itself, it lays out specific parameters for the amount, for how wide the sidewalk has to be to pass through. I believe it's 2 meters, but it might be 1.8. And if the utility pole or whatever other encroachment is there prevents it from having that width, then it would not count as a qualifying sidewalk.
Great, thank you. For the next question, this is from Javiera. What do you recommend for medium-sized cities where low density predominates and only the urban center has more density? A great question considered, seeing how medium-sized cities are on the rise throughout different countries.
That's a really good question. I don't think that the size of the city should prevent it from being walkable. And I don't think necessarily that the size of the city would make any of these metrics not operate as well. So with that in mind, you could use the metrics in a medium-sized city or a small city. And if the metric scores poorly, the policy recommendations would also likely work. So for example, with visually active frontage, say you use this in a medium-sized city and your neighborhood doesn't do well in this metric, you can still go to whoever your city official is, and these policy recommendations, I think, would still work. You can still have these building regulations that allow for this sort of visually active frontage. I think, yeah, so I think that the size of the city shouldn't impact the ability to use the tool too much. But if we are testing it in more places and find out it does, we'll certainly take that into account when we're reviewing the tool.
Great, thank you. And unfortunately, this will be our last question. I want to thank all of our attendees for submitting so many. But like I mentioned, the tool and the PowerPoint and the recording will be made available afterwards. So I hope that some of those questions can be answered if you explore all the links again. So this question is from two attendees. Can you just redefine what is a shared street, or what is a street that allows for walking and multiple modes?
Yeah, so a shared street, I won't go. A shared street is one that has motor vehicles, cycling, and people all on it at the same time. I'm trying to think of an example off of the top of my head, and I can't, but I know that I think there are several in Copenhagen and Denmark. But so a shared street, usually the cars are moving very slowly, and the space is really prioritized for people. The cars are yielding to the people. And the reason that we count it for pedestrian, and as a piece of pedestrian infrastructure is because it really is shifting the priority to them. Cars move down shared streets slowly. It's not a efficient means of travel down a shared street, especially. If you go into the tool, I think that we define it a little more specifically than I am right now. So I would recommend doing that.
Great, thanks, Joe. Thank you again for this great presentation today. For all of our attendees, as mentioned earlier, the webinar recording, PowerPoint, and tool will be made available through my follow-up email and also available on our website, itdp.org. As for our upcoming webinars, I would like to point out one we are having next week on optimizing dockless bike share for cities. This is one webinar, but we are offering it at 2 times because we will have co-hosts, one here in DC and one in Guangzhou, China. So please sign up for either April 10th at 10 a.m. or April 12th at 9 p.m., whichever time fits best for you. And then the last webinar we are having this month is with Genevieve Giuliano. She is one of the VREF researchers that we work with and also will be a speaker at Mobilize Dar es Salaam. She will speak on freight and environmental justice. So this will be on April 25th at 1 p.m. So in my follow-up email, I will include registration links for all these webinars as well as the other materials I mentioned before. Thank you again to all of our